Greetings to everyone from coast to coast. Welcome to today's session on day 2, and we are in for a treat. We hope that everyone's well, and thank you for joining us today for this critical conversation focused on literacy development of African American males with Dr. Alfred Tatum. My name is Ellison Yoshimoto Tauri. I'm the Chief Academic Officer for the Los Angeles Unified School District, and it is my pleasure to be with you today. After introducing this session, I look forward to learning alongside of you and moderating the Q&A at the conclusion. We are a proud member of the Council of Great City Schools, who have been a tremendous partner for us over the years and invaluable over the last 15 months. I'm also a member of the Trial Urban District Assessment Task Force, which brings unique attention to urban education in relation to the NAEP, which, as you know, provides an essential measurement of student achievement across the country. NAEP data tell us that overwhelmingly, collectively, we have much learning to do in order to give our African American students, particularly our boys, what they deserve. Dr. Alfred Tatum is one of our nation's most prominent educational researchers of African American boys. He has written close to 70 publications on this topic, including 3 books with a 4th book on the way, all focused on supporting African and Black males. Dr. Tatum is currently the Provost and Executive Vice President at the Metropolitan State University of Denver. I want you to know the kind of person Dr. Tatum is by sharing that he has asked juvenile court judges in Cook County, Illinois, to assign young males to the University of Illinois Chicago Reading Clinic instead of being incarcerated. That is his moral compass, and he walks his talk. His current work focuses on moving U.S. students to advanced levels of reading, writing, and intellectual development. We must reverse the cultural and disciplinary erasure experienced by Black males in this country. And this session could not be more timely. There have always been inequities for our students of color, in particular our African American community. Yet the pandemic has highlighted and deepened the urgency. Our nation is overdue, overdrawn, and overdraft in supporting our African American males. And now we must go into overdrive. We cannot wait longer, not a minute longer, to get this right for our African American males. And looking at the NAEP data tell us that this is a national emergency. What do African American male readers need from us? We're going to find out. Reading is a civil right, and Dr. Tatum's motto is arm yourself with intellect and the passion to create change. So without further ado, let's get started, and everyone please join me in snapping it up for Dr. Tatum.
Good morning. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about creating an early intellectual infrastructure of advanced literacy and knowledge development for Black boys in the elementary grades, particularly in the context of the current NAEP assessment data. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk about a theoretical and practical frame, and you'll see what I mean by an advanced literacy and knowledge development as we move forward. First, I'd like to put this in a broader context. When we think about the state of reading achievement, before I talk about the state of Black male literacy achievement, you can see some data here, 56 million students in the US, but out of that 56 million students across 17,000 school districts, at the 4th grade level, we only have about 4% of students reading at an advanced level. A lot of the conversation has been skewed toward basic and proficient. I'm going to tilt us in a different direction because I think this tilting will lead to different authorizations. But as we think about reading achievement in the United States, we do know some things definitively, but there are a lot of things that we do not know. The field of reading is still in search of itself. There is a great deal of improvising, theorizing, legitimizing, and conceptualizing. And as a result of that, we are in a nation in which 51 million students do not achieve advanced levels. And it's almost taboo because the focus has been on basic and proficient, which I think contributes to our long-standing dilemma in the US and our reading scores and writing flatlining. But as it relates to Black boys in particular, when I look at some of the research, it does three things. One, it documents Black boys' negative school experiences. Two, it offers ways to challenge and transform the experiences of Black boys by rejecting a deficit-oriented discourse. And three, the current research primarily highlights culturally responsive approaches to teaching to, one, increase engagement and academic motivation, and to promote a positive identity. And if I put these two in context, this is one of the grand dilemmas I think we have in the US, and why very few of our students, nation children, are reading at advanced levels. And I refer to these as forms of aggression. There is an aggression toward basic and proficient reading. It's in school report cards. It's how we generally report the national data. And because of that, it creates this national ethos around basic and proficient. Somehow we have released our focus from advanced levels of reading. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about, particularly as it relates to Black boys, there is a know your place disciplinary aggression. As you'll see throughout this morning's presentation, we have severed our students' relationships across the disciplines, and this has a negative impact for both high-performing and low-performing readers. That does a couple of things. It leads to intellectual laziness or academic laziness. So, for example, depending on the level of challenge or difficulty, we can ask students to use 30% or 40% of their brain power. And then when something becomes intellectually challenging, that's when students start to have problems. You just can't go from 30% to 100% of your brain power. And so that's why it's going to be important to think about using an exponential growth of reading achievement if we want to move students toward advanced levels of literacy development. Now, there is a well-worn story about Emmett Till, who was murdered in 1955. And his body was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. And it was written that there was an expectation that his body would never rise from the bottom. I use this as a parallel when I'm talking about the literacy development of Black boys. And I'm going to read this because I think it puts it in context. So while humanist, transhumanist, and artificial intelligence researchers are discussing the complexity of superintelligence and engaging in public debates about how much smarter things can get in the future, the focus on the literacy development in public schools, particularly for Black boys, has settled on debates about ways to. So you have superintelligence on one end. As a nation, we're talking about basic and proficient reading. The distance between these debates are light years apart, and it really has parked our focus on an 18th century conceptualization where census data indicated if a person could read or not. So if we continue to approach this, we will never rise from the bottom as a nation, and this will adversely impact some students more than others. So in the form of the Black intellectual tradition, there are 7 ways for advanced literacy and intellectual development for Black boys. And I'll give examples of each of these. 1, interdisciplinarity. So historically, Black males did not park their literacy development in one domain or one discipline, they were regularly writing and thinking and acting across multiple disciplines. Writing is the true intellectual exercise. That's a pathway for advanced literacy development. I'll talk about how writing can be informed by a wide range of reading, passion for ideas, voracious reading, knowledge accumulation. This is going to be critical as we move forward. Having these analytical and interpretive tools, and then the desire to shape the thinking of others. So essentially, these 7 pathways were used as tools of protection for Black males historically, and it informs my work in modern day context. However, these 7 pathways don't neatly align with focusing on basic and proficient. Yes, we will have to teach kids how to read and write, word study, fluency, comprehension, and writing, but that's just the basic foundation. But on top of that, we have to make sure that they have this opportunity for exponential growth in reading and writing. So it does 2 things, or 3 things. All educators must, and I found this extremely powerful, we must interrogate our literacy authorizations. We are authorizing underperformance. The other thing that we have to interrogate is our slow growth model. And so reading achievement is usually focused or thought about in 5-year increments. If we think about school improvement plans, this is really a slow growth orientation. I'll talk about that a bit. And then we have to interrogate our instructional and curricular practices. Here's an example of what I mean, a slow growth orientation that requires interrogation. Looking at one district's goals, the percent of all 3rd grade students on track in reading will increase from 52 to 72% by June 2023, as measured by the assessment that was used. And so we're saying we will wait 3 years to move kids on track. This, again, aligns with what I was mentioning earlier, that we create blockades to reading achievement, and it skews our authorization. A second goal in the same school district, the percent of Black male 3rd grade students on track in reading will increase from 35% by June 2023, as measured by, again, this district's assessment. So we have 35% of students reading on track, being on track in reading. 2 years from now, that gives us permission in some ways to slow walk them through school. The dilemma is there is no reading research that says this approach or this strategy only moves this percent of students. This is when race and reading become stitched, and you see that a difference from goal 1 compared to the Black male reading on track in goal 2 is significantly different. Never rise from the bottom. We are building in inequities in our reading instruction. This does not align with the Black male literacy tradition, but we say this publicly, and then we try to figure out why a larger percentage of our students are not reading at an advanced level. And here we're not even beginning to pay attention to advanced level according to NAEP's definition. So what does on track look like on a daily basis? This is what I wrestle with in my work. On track to what and for what? And then what are the appropriate literacy levers, in my estimation, to move students at a greater momentum and accelerate their reading achievement and not delaying the underperformance of a high percentage of students for a 3-year period. So here's an example of the Black intellectual tradition. And I use this as a literacy GPS to really think about instructional practices. So James Baldwin wrote The Price of the Ticket, series of essays, very, very powerful. I will just read the text in red because I think it highlights the focus that is important here. So turn his peculiar status in the Western world to his own advantage. How do we think about that as we plan or think about instruction and curricular practices in school? How do we make sure that literacy is turned to the advantage of young African-American boys? And then it says that which will give him sustenance and a voice. And so that's thinking about reading, writing in powerful ways that gives these young boys the sustenance, the strength, but the voice. And if I look at the literacy GPS on the right in terms of the Black intellectual tradition, I'm just going to give an example from Dr. King's work, Strength to Love. In this very brief excerpt, he's referring to the Copernican revolution, Darwinian theory of natural selection, as he's talking about the progress of men. What that indicates is he has a high volume of scientific consciousness that's connected to a social reality. And then if you look at the text on the left, Baldwin also illustrates a high degree of social consciousness as he talks about the geography. So historically, Black men were reading and writing across a wide range of text. And so when I think about OnTrack for reading, how do you put students on track for the intellectual tradition, the Black intellectual tradition, to make sure they have the requisite skills and strategies to use language and text in powerful ways? This is not an outgrowth of basic and proficient reading. It's an orientation of something deeper, broader, and more sophisticated. And we need to begin to create this early intellectual infrastructure, not saying that we want to move our boys from 35% to 72% on track to reading. But again, if we don't clearly define on track as it connects to this broader historical tradition, we will continue to miss the mark. And many of these boys will never rise from the bottom. But additionally, our high-performing Black male students will be underserved. Now, I put this large red X here based on some of the things that I witnessed in the early elementary grades. And so it's unlikely to find that you have Black male students reading across these disciplines in the elementary grades: physics, chemistry, sociology, engineering, economics, philosophy. This is somewhat of a delayed orientation, but there are good texts where students could develop wide ranges of knowledge and development in appropriate ways. Why is this problematic? If we think about the long-term trajectory across the disciplines, we find Black males underrepresented. There are still some universities, departments in universities that have relatively few Black boys or Black men as physics professors or chemistry professors or engineering professors. And so let's start thinking about that trajectory early on, thus me referring to this presentation as creating an early intellectual infrastructure that nurtures this difference. We are not going to interrupt disciplinary inequity at the university level. We have to start thinking about this in the elementary grades, particularly as it relates to Black boys. So there's some critical questions or guiding questions that we can ask. What is the model of a highly literate student? What is true literacy? How do we know when we get it right? How do students represent our literacy offerings? And number 5 is the one I think that we are ignoring as a nation. What does it take to move students toward advanced reading, writing, and intellectual development? This is despite parenting. This is despite the economic status of homes. This is despite the fact that we have some students attending high poverty schools, others attending low poverty schools. How do we think about question number 5 as an equalizer? So I'm going to spend the remaining time talking about ways I concretized this Black male literacy tradition, moving students toward advanced levels of reading and writing without leaving the reader behind. I have to say this: we can only teach reading if we know how to teach reading. We can only teach writing if we know how to teach writing. But how we conceptualize both are critically important. So this is a multidimensional reading model. At the bottom of this, you see it's very important, particularly in the elementary grades, to nurture students' concept of reading, nurture reading fluency, and making sure that we teach word study well, fluency, phonemic awareness, decoding, etc. How do we engage students to apply vocabulary, assess comprehension of both reading and writing that focuses on both personal growth and academic growth? So if we're talking about on reading in this way, it's a very different orientation. If we're talking about on track to reading by looking at what's referred to as a Zoom zone, making sure students can decode well, have reading fluency and concept of reading, that's foundational. But you miss all of this stuff above if we don't reorient how we think about literacy instruction. Here's an example. I refer to this as a textual literacy frame. And in 54 words, this came from Michael Eric Dyson. In 54 words, he writes, a Black presidency, politics, in parens, I put the parens there, is undeniably interracial in the same way that Obama's body is composed of Black and white genes. Obama's presidency is a symbolic love child of Notes on the State of Virginia and The Fire Next Time. Thomas Jefferson and James Baldwin gaze at us from two immortal purchases, separated by 2 centuries. In 54 words, he writes about politics, sociology, science, Black and white genes. He adds a metaphor, the symbolic love child, and he cites 2 texts, Notes on the State of Virginia and The Fire Next Time, separated by 2 centuries. So there is an understanding of history. So when I think about Black boys in elementary grades, I say, how can they write a paragraph similar to this textual literacy frame? If you're able to do this, you are going to be at a basic and proficient level. But if I look at the NAEP definition of advanced, this represents an advanced reading and writing across multiple text. So while some people may say on level or on track in one way, I'm thinking about on level and on track in this way for Black boys in elementary grades. And I'll give you some illustrative examples. But before I do that, I shared this with a group of teachers. It's 130 words, similar to the text that I shared. And someone mentioned to me, it will take my boys 100 years to read and write the way you were talking about. The way I was talking about is 130 words that you see on the right. 100 years to write 130 words. That's what I mean by a slow growth orientation. And so if that's the mindset, what we effectively begin to do is turn down the volume of the text, have students reading and writing less. And as a result of that, these students never rise from the bottom of the literacy well. And for those who are performing extremely well, they do not start moving towards the literacy stratosphere. But I clearly demonstrated to this teacher that that's not the case. If you think about the example that I shared earlier about the third grade students taking 3 years to read and write in a particular way, this is a Black boy who was with me for 5 days. Think about the textual literacy frame. I said I want the boys reading and writing in a particular way. Day 4, he wrote, child labor is not good. Children have pens in their hands, not tools, Iqbal. Very short and abbreviated text. I'll talk about how we arrived here. But day 5, designer babies are a new discovery. Hideo Kojima said genetic engineering as a result of a science advancement. So I don't think that itself is bad. He's citing one of the authors. Think about the earlier text with the textual literacy frame. Rogers said, I think ethics and morals of genetic engineering are very complicated. He's citing a second author. Again, I'm preparing these students to read and write across multiple texts and then use their own thought processes as they begin to move forward. This is the Black male intellectual tradition. Day 4, he was writing about sociology, didn't do so well. Day 5, he's writing about engineering. He's citing multiple authors. But on the right-hand side, if you look at the bottom chart, I charted this boy's writing similar to the writings of, you see, Dr. King and Michael Eric Dyson. That became the focus of the writing, just using those examples of the Black male literature tradition. It doesn't take Black boys 100 years to write this way. And if we learn ways or we adopt ways to engage them without depressing their literacy instruction, we will see something very differently. This too holds true for students across all ethnic groups. But today I'm just providing examples of Black boys. Here's another student's writing. Day 4. He's writing about child labor, but if you see, he's citing authors, he's giving his views about child labor, and when I assess their writing, he's writing across the discipline of law. Law is usually not a topic in the elementary grades. He's writing about child labor, and he's citing others. So now, and there's still some work to do. If we look at the last sentence, people are dying in child labor. We still have to make sure we pay attention to the mechanics of writing as well. But now they're writing, they're thinking, they're moving toward personal development and intellectual development, which I think is the goal. So here's an example of text that I put in front of boys to nurture the type of writing that you saw. This is going back, this is another engineering text. One deals with artificial electronic skin. And on the right-hand side, you say engineers invent a bottle that empties to the last drop. This is roughly 300 words that students are reading. These are 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade boys as part of the reading instruction. I'll talk about more about the instructional approach in a second, but if you look at this, I'm not turning down the volume of the text. The words are quite challenging, but now these boys have to read and write across multiple texts. It's going to be very hard for students to remain at not achieve a basic level, but even remain at a proficient level if they're reading and writing this way during every hour of instruction with a teacher who's making sure they have the requisite skills and requisite knowledge moving forward. Sorely, I have witnessed students reading less than 10 words during an hour of instruction. And that's not rare in some cases where they're actually reading and thinking across the text and where they're carrying the cognitive load. So if and what you see is this young 4th grade boy actually reading and writing across multiple texts that led to the writing that you see. So when I say what does OnTrack look like on a daily basis, it's moving students in this direction. On track for what and for what? It's on track to this Black intellectual tradition. And what are the appropriate literacy levers? You saw in the diagram, it's making sure there's word study, fluency development, applying vocabulary, demonstrating their comprehension of both reading and writing, and moving them to academic development and personal development. Now, what happens if we neglect to focus on this exponential growth of instruction and we delay Black boys' literacy achievement? This leads to both cultural and disciplinary erasures. As I talked about earlier, we have very few Black men in the nation who are professors in physics or chemistry. We have yet to have an American-born African-American male earn a Nobel Prize in physics or medicine. We won the Nobel Peace Prize. We won prize in literature, but not the sciences. Something is in the water that's preventing this from happening. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, the outcomes are the same. So Black boys, building Black boys' relationship with the disciplines is central to advance reading, writing, and intellectual development. This is true for high and low performing readers and writers. We have to build their relationships with the disciplines. When I started this in Chicago, for example, I looked at the Harvard undergraduate catalog, and I could have looked at any undergraduate catalog. These were the disciplines for their undergraduates. I said, if it's great or good enough for the undergraduates, it's good enough for young Black boys in the elementary grades. Sorely, and I wrote about this some years ago, on our march towards basic and proficient reading, we are severing the reading and writing lineages of African American boys. And I say this is one of the great tragedies of American education. And so oftentimes I ask young boys, if you read anything meaningful and significant, something you think you'll always remember, oftentimes the answer is no, reading inside of classrooms. And so many of their textual lineages look like this. Here's an example of my textual lineage for middle school. As an example, these are books that are part of me. And it took me some years to realize that most of these texts were sociological in nature. They made all of the difference in the world. It allowed me to pick up and read scientific text. But somehow someone authorized these types of texts for me, and they deauthorized other types of text. Here I am, a high-performing reader, read anything that you put in front of me, but this is my scientific lineage from middle school and high school, inside of classrooms. Someone turned down the volume of the science text, and if I wasn't one of those boys that befriended the library early on and just fell in love with reading science, I would have been put at a disadvantage scientifically. And so as we think about advanced literacy development, how do we nurture both social consciousness and scientific consciousness? And if this happened to a high-performing Black boy, just imagine what's happening to Black boys who struggle with text. And this is what some of the students' writing lineages look like. I said, have you wrote something that you found meaningful and significant? That's why I had those young Black boys writing about child labor, engineering, physics, medicine, etc. You're turning up the volume, or you're turning up the writing volume, so you build these textual lineages. Students become or teachers may become inadvertent accomplices to turning this down based on goals. So if I'm thinking about having third grade boys or fourth grade boys on track over a 3-year period, am I thinking about building their reading lineages, their writing lineages, their social consciousness, and their scientific consciousness? Oftentimes, those are contradictory to one another in terms of how they are envisioned. So writing. Writing is a true intellectual exercise. It is absolutely important that we engage young boys in voracious reading around a wide range of topics. So I asked a couple questions. What leads a Black boy to write? What leads an elementary aged Black boy to write about statistics, economics, sociology, neuroscience, history, and culture? And then what leads him to write about these topics at the same time? And then what leads Black boys to ask questions or insert themselves into social and scientific phenomena or controversy shaping human history? That's a different type of orientation. That's not a basic and proficient orientation. That's an advanced orientation. Because if we want these things to occur, we have to approach our instruction and our curricular orientations very differently. So, advanced literacy, what does it look like? 1, read text that spans the social sciences and the physical sciences. 2, increase the daily volume of text read by students. 3, build their textual lineages. 4, create outlets and environments for students to share text and writing. And then engage students in literacy collaboratives with cause-based readings. There was a recent article in the New York Times that talked about genetic alibis and how the deaths of Black men were attributed to sickle cell anemia. Well, if these young men are not reading about genetics or sickle cell traits, they are not in a position to protect themselves scientifically. We often talk about social justice. We have to make sure that we're not ignoring scientific justice, because this too is a pathway of protection. And we want to begin to nurture this for Black boys as early as the elementary grades. So powerful text in tandem with powerful reading and writing instruction can have a significant influence on the lives of all students. But also powerful text can also light the way for educators to move students to advanced levels of literacy and away from branded inferiority. Now, this may not seem obvious, but if you say certain students we're going to move certain students 52% to read OnTrack, and then we're going to move another group 35% OnTrack, that's a branded inferiority. It's based on existing data that we have, but to make that determination in school systems indicates that we will have 2 trains running, and some trains are on a darker track. And that train involves our young Black boys. So in sum, literacy instruction has to be wide enough and deep enough to counter an historical ugliness rooted in multiple forms of exploitation that has manifested into academic underperformance. We see this with NAEP reading scores, social unrest, and personal and social suffocating for many students. But literacy also has to be wide enough to break new ground and fashion new imaginations and new realities. Unfortunately, we live in a nation where discussions of moving Black boys to advanced levels is taboo because we don't perceive it as a reality based on existing scores. So how do we start talking about advanced levels of literacy development when you have a 20-year track record of a high percent of students reading at basic and proficient? At some point, we have to look at the attributions very differently. It's not the Black boys, it's how we're thrusting literacy instruction upon them. So what is the model of a literate kid? I started with these questions. It's one that embraces and engages in a harsh schedule of reading, writing, and thinking. It's just happening in our classrooms. What is true literacy? It leads to knowledge development and leads to grapplings. It's more than having students on track. How do we know when we got it right? Students become, do, and think differently as a result of their reading and writing. There's also intellectual development and personal development. I offer this needs to take place across the disciplines. How do students represent our literacy offerings? In a variety of ways. My goal is high academic performance and this exercised humanity. That's why it's important to read text like child labor and genetic engineering. How do you start thinking about this early on? And then what does it take to move students toward advanced reading, writing, and intellectual development? Powerful instruction, powerful text, but moreover, it's our strong conceptualization. Resolutions in the tradition of the Black intellectual framework. Be it resolved, we will build students' reading and writing lineages across the disciplines. Be it resolved, we will develop a stronger, better defined literacy movement in the United States. Be it resolved, we will move beyond narrow frames of scholarship. And be it resolved, we will seek to destroy everything that goes against our students' humanity. Sharon Flake wrote this: a Black boy don't get 100 chances to get it right. Sometimes he just gets one. That's it. You blow your chance, you blow your life. This is not true. Young boys need a chance to recover, nurture their resilience, as we put them on this pathway for advanced literacy development. So what if a student does not come to our classrooms with strong alphabetic knowledge? What do we do? And what's our literacy GPS to move them in that direction? Far too many boys can adopt this as their reality. And as a result, we have some students surrender their life chances before they get to know their life choices. But on the other hand, we have some of our high-performing boys surrendering to low academic performance because they're not challenged. They're only asked to use 30% of their brain when they have the capacity to use so much more. And then Jewel Rhodes wrote in the book Ghost Boys, I'm still dead, doesn't seem fair, nobody ever paid me attention, I skated by, kept my head low, and now I'm famous. She's talking about the death of young men across the nation, but this skating by as a nation, I think we're allowing many students to skate by just by focus on basic and proficient, and this has long-term consequences. Let's give these young boys the attention they deserve right now because we know it shapes their long-term intellectual trajectory, their personal trajectory, and their economic trajectory. Why is it important to place these young boys in an early, advanced intellectual infrastructure? Because it's not just about students' literacy development, and it's about their lives. If we take this and we think about what it means to be on track, do we approach literacy instruction very differently? Super intelligence on one end, basic and proficient on the other, they're light years apart, but somehow Black boys are caught between this dilemma.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Dr. Tatum, thank you so much again for being with us this afternoon. I'm Allison Yoshimoto-Tari. You saw me in the intro community from Los Angeles. Nice to see you. So powerful. I wanted to start with the quote that you ended with, which is, it's not just about students' literacies, it's about their lives. And I read in your bio that you've actually encouraged the court system to have students go to your reading institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago, rather than to go into the juvenile system. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so there was a deep concern. I visited with juvenile court judges, and I found that many of these boys were defaulted on their literacy instruction. And so when you think about transitioning back into society, it was important to get them a leg up. And so that was designed. A lot of talk about the school to prison pipeline. I wanted to create the juvenile prison to college pipeline. And if I could advance their literacy development as a tool of protection, it would lead to a pathway of reentry, recovery, empowerment, and less recidivism. That was the goal.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you have so many stories of actual boys that you've helped through that process. For those of us listening today, we have several people here from across the country. For people who feel like we're doing so much, but it's just not enough, where would you say would be the 1, 2, 3? Where would we start?
I would really pay attention to complementing powerful instruction and powerful text. And so learn as much as we can about reading instruction. I mean, for those who struggle and for those who do not, but also become unbounded by the text that we put in front of young students. We should never postpone intellectual development while we're helping young students become better readers and writers. So always remember, there's a power in the word, there's power in a sentence, in a paragraph, in a page, and in an entire text. Let's give students access at each of
to make sure that they are not underserved in our classrooms.
And I emphasize that we want to make sure that our high-performing students are not underserved, but we definitely want to make sure that our low-performing students are not underserved.
You're actually talking about a different way of teaching. You're like keeping those expectations higher as students are building skills. And you talked about interdisciplinary knowledge accumulation, ensuring that there's passion there, right? And there's voracious reading happening, going on. We had a question in the chat earlier about what kinds of the text that our African-American Black boys have access to in the classroom. Do you have more suggestions for that? Types of text, where to get those texts, how to choose those texts?
I have to start here. All text belong to Black boys. All text across the disciplines. The reason I shared my textual lineage that was primary sociological, I think there was some intention to pay attention to the fact that I was a Black boy on the south side of Chicago. But I'm also a Black boy in the universe. So I could study Black boys, but I can also study the Black whole. So think about text from two perspectives. What are the most exciting contemporary texts that are being used? And you can find this on Flipboard, for example. I mean, you have free access to text. It's a phone app. So you can always access this, but start thinking about the text across the disciplines. So how do you balance that? And what we're trying to do is water the seed. So if they fall in love with child labor, then be prepared to give them a novel that goes along with that. So you can extend the text. All texts belong to all Black boys. Think about text across the disciplines and think about how we can make it developmentally appropriate to nurture both social and scientific consciousness.
Thank you for that. We have people wanting to know, how do they get a hold of you after today if they have questions for you?
Just email me.
Do you have a website? Do you have a website or?
No, you can just email me. I'll put my email in the chat, my personal email, so I could still be provost in the morning and reading person by day. So I put my personal email in the chat for anyone who wants to contact me. I love to have these conversations too. So it's exciting to me that others want to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. And I'll just say, perhaps, is there, for those folks at state levels and at district levels, do you have any suggestions for how to build consensus around doing this work, or how to create enough dissatisfaction with our current systems and structures to make this really operationalized in every school and every classroom?
Yeah, I think this is going to have to be multi-faceted. Leadership plays a significant role. Working with a school district now, principal made a huge difference. But classroom teachers can also lead the pathway forward. And so once you start having extreme and supreme successes, then share that information if you're doing something extraordinary. And the other thing from district-wide perspectives, are we asking the right question? And how are we thinking about our authorizations? And will they get us where we want to go? Right. But I think for a school-wide level, principals is critical, but teachers can provide that pathway as well.
Thank you for that. I feel like we might need to be wrapping up shortly, but I did want to say, certainly today is a call for action for all of us. The pandemic raised equity challenges that we knew existed, but have certainly deepened as a result of the last 16 months. And I hope you will stay close to the Council of Great City Schools. They'll work with this team today, with EIS and all of us, so that we can really make this a reality, in every classroom, every day, for all of our students.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Thank you. We'll be in touch.